by the light in my hand, by the breath within me, by the earth which I touch, by the names of the spirits, by the resplendent angel, together with the princesses of Mercury and Earth, I conjure thee.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank Salem Horror Fest for accepting our pitch. And we're so happy to be here. Super, super excited. This is our first appearance ever for Salem Horror Fest. So thank you.
Yeah, and before we get into this exciting movie that I just cannot wait to talk about, I'm literally bursting at the seams. We would just want to thank Morbidly Beautiful, which is our podcast network and family. Morbidly Beautiful is your macabre home away from home with horror news, reviews, editorials, and more. They support everyone within the horror community, from special effects artists, indie filmmakers, writers, women, LGBTQ folks, and so much more. And Kelly and I have been so happy to be part of that spooky team for over a year now. So please go to morbidlybeautiful.com to find out more. And now on with the show.
Spinsters of Horror. This is a time once a month where Jess puts down her bloody knitting needles and I step away from the TV to discuss horror movies and sometimes other horror mediums with thoughtful analysis, research, and passion.
And if this is your first time being introduced to who we are, we flew into the horror scene July of 2018 to assist in filling the void of female voices in podcasting with our show, I Spit on Your Podcast. As women, we knew that the genre was dominated by the masculine perspective, so we felt it was important to celebrate and encourage female horror fans while at the same time remaining inclusive to all people who love what horror has to offer. So you can find me, Jess, behind the scenes editing the podcast and crafting, while Kelly is normally found in her dark basement, as you can see, with a mug of black coffee, heading up our social media. We're just really excited to be here at not our first festival appearance, but our second one with Salem Horror Fest, but first for Salem Horror Fest.
Yes. So in this episode, we will discuss how Season of the Witch is representative of the dual nature within women, seen in the archetypes of the witch versus the wife. We will explore the role of the wife in Western culture and the societal expectations placed upon women in the 1970s. Also popular during this time was the rise of witchcraft and occultism among primarily white women due to the independence it created. As well, we will examine the image of the witch as representative of feminism and sexual freedom that could be seen taking place during the sexual revolution in which Season of the Witch takes place. As we watch Joan move from the role of a desperate, constrained housewife and mother to a sexually liberated witch, Season of the Witch suggests that she potentially traded one gilded cage for another. How does Romero's perspective about these roles compare that to two alternative women living their unconventional lives in 2021? This is what we intend to find out in probing the more obscure and underrated 1973 film. So pick your poison and listen on if you dare.
All right. So usually Kelly and I, whenever we're doing a regular podcast episode, like to talk about our stories with the films that we are going to talk about. So Kelly, tell me your story with the Season of the Witch.
Well, I watched it for the first time for our fourth episode on witches and empowerment. Before that, though, how I had heard about Season of the Witch, because I hadn't, I think, not heard of it before that point in time, but your first podcast called The Dark Spectrum did an episode on Season of the Witch. And that's pretty much, if I can remember correctly, how I even learned about this movie existing in the first place, because it is, why we're talking about it today, a very severely underrated George Romero classic.
I 100% agree with you. So yes, my first introduction with Season of the Witch was through my prior podcast, The Dark Spectrum. And when I was introduced to it, I obviously fell in love with this film. I love it so much. Yeah. When it came out on Arrow Video, I got myself a copy, the special edition, so I can see the extended cuts. And yeah, I did a podcast episode on it. And then Kelly and I revisited again for our fourth episode because I was just so adamant. I'm like, we need to talk about this film. There's so much to talk about this film. And yeah, and so now when we had this opportunity to pitch for Salem Horror Fest, and they were like, hey, it has to be Romero themed, I'm just like, I've got the movie I want to talk about right now. So yeah, this is it. It's just one of my favorite movies. I think I've watched it 2 or 3 times a year now.
Wow. Yeah. Wow, you do love it. Okay, let's jump into your likes. Why do you love this movie?
So I love this movie so much because like the symbolism of this film, it is so striking, especially the first like maybe 10 minutes of the film, the opening sequences when you see Joan walking behind her husband, the brambles in her face, the symbolism of her dreams. Like it is very poignant and on point about what women were experiencing back in the 1970s. And I love the imagery. I love the fact that Season of the Witch, the song by Donovan, is being played through, and it's like a very witchy montage, you know, as she's getting her supplies and her dresses. And it's just like there's so much critique that's happening. Yes, it's a bit of a slow paced movie, and yes, it has its faults in certain areas of the misogyny of the place, but that's what's important about that when you're watching this film. And I love the music and I love all the imagery, and I can relate to it. Like I resonate hardcore with this film.
Yeah, I get that. I can totally see why you would love this movie. This is very much a Jess movie. Jess loves 1970s horror in films overall anyways. So every time now I watch a 70s movie, I'm like, yes, yeah, I can totally see this as a Jess movie. Absolutely. For myself, I do like this movie. I think it is underrated. It's subtle, but full of rich symbolism, which I like a lot. And I was really, really happy to revisit this. There's some really great like witchcraft related scenes. There's some very moving scenes of the struggles of these middle-aged women and their marriages and how deeply unhappy they are. Yeah. It is very poignant, like you said, for women then, but I also think it resonates still now in 2021, which is why, again, another reason why we're talking about it, because it is universal. Like it crosses generations, it crosses decades. And the song Season of the Witch by Donovan fits perfectly within that movie, and I love a good montage. Yeah.
Do you have any dislikes of this film?
I do. It mainly is just that it is slow. Yeah. And before we started recording, I was asking Jess about the extended edition, being like, wow, how much more time does it add to this movie? Because it is not action packed. I'm not going to put out there and I don't want anybody to have expectations, so to speak, of what this movie might be. It's not a Dawn of the Dead. It's not not a Day of the Dead, which sometimes those movies, they kind of go along at a slightly slower pace than, let's say, movies of now. But I think it's more thematically interesting than I think it is overly entertaining for me.
Yeah, I will definitely agree with you. When people go into this film, they're like, oh, this film was done by George Romero. They're expecting like something like The Crazies, or they're expecting something like his earlier films of the zombie films, but it's not that. It is very subtle. It is very just symbolic. There's so much symbolism in it. So I can understand why people would be like, turned off by when they're used to that other type of film by Romero.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. What about dislikes for you? Is there anything?
Well, like I said, before when I hadn't watched the extended cut yet, I was like, oh, the pacing of this film, I agree, it was too long. But then also because I was also finding that there were scenes that were cut in such a way that I'm like, oh, there's important information that we're missing. Like, who is this Mary character that she talks about? I end up finding out that's the housekeeper, because there's a whole scene where she's talking to the housekeeper, and the housekeeper's like, ooh, look at that outfit you're wearing. Don't get someone to come after you.
Oh, so Joan has a housekeeper?
She has a housekeeper. Yeah. Right. So there's some important points that get cut out from the film that are actually really add to the richness of the film and really that relates to it. So if anyone ever has the opportunity to see the extended cut, I recommend it. It obviously adds 20 more minutes to the film and of this already slow pace, but for an entirety of a film, it really just adds more context to it. So I don't like what they did for the original cut, because it just takes out so much important information, but in the new one, in the extended, you get more of that. So
totally,
by getting that, I dislike it less. Oh, in the sense of like, I love this film. I just, there's less to dislike for me, except for the men, but we all know that, right? We all know what they represent in this film.
Exactly. They're kind of easy to dislike. Sorry.
Yeah, they are.
Should we move on to Jack's wife?
Yeah, so let's jump into this. So when we start this film, like I said, I wanted to start before I jump into talking about the feminine mystique, and Kelly and I were start talking about the rise of second wave feminism, is this film is very poignant in the very beginning of that opening sequence of Joan walking through she essentially shows us what it's like to be a woman in the 1970s. You get married, you have a baby, you lose a sense of innocence, you're a slave to your husband, he treats you like a dog, your therapist keeps you in your marriage. Like, she is unhappy, right? And so this is so important when you watch this, because you start thinking about the feminine mystique. And so in 1963, the feminine mystique was a book written by Betty Friedan that sold over 3 million copies in dozens of languages all over the world, that was rebuking post World War II beliefs that women could find greater fulfillment in domestic life, performing chores and taking care of children. This book was astounding because it was saying to women, hey, you don't have to accept this. This is not necessarily your role in life. The only reason why you feel like this is your role in life is because this patriarchy tells you it. That there's a inherent system of sexism that tells women that their place is within the home. And if they're unhappy, it's not because of the system, it's because they're broken and they have to make themselves happy.
And though the feminine mystique is not at all mentioned in Season of the Witch, we're not saying it is, but I can say, think it directly relates to what Joan is going through. Absolutely. Her struggle as a middle-class white wife with a husband and a daughter, and she doesn't really appear to have a career or a job besides housewife. Mm-hmm. And yeah, the feminist mystique caused a ruckus. The feminine mystique actually, like, it essentially rallied against the problem that had no name. Like you said, this systemic sexism that was teaching women that their place was in the home. And so what was revolutionary about it is its reach. Word of mouth, a wife reads this book, tells all of her friends, probably in a book club. They tell their friends, they tell their friends, they tell their, like, the teacher of their, of their kids at school. Like, their reach was incredible, passed on amongst women. It was all about social equality.
And it's so interesting because of the way it starts, right? Like, Betty Friedan came up with these ideas and concepts at a college reunion where she's talking with other women, her peers in the academic field. And she's like, you're experiencing the same dissatisfaction. Oh, this is not like here. We are all feeling this. And then by writing the book and making it accessible to middle-aged women in their homes and stuff like that, it took the idea of feminism from the academic world and brought it into the home and into the sphere, and something that everyone can relate to and have discussions about.
Absolutely. A woman's occupation essentially was housewife. And, it was essentially our systems that were oppressing us at the time was telling us how we should live our lives, us as women. I'm saying I wasn't there in the 70s, but it boxed them into a very mentally and emotionally unchallenging, unmentally stimulating life. And I'd say that there were folks that were opposed to, generally speaking, the feminine mystique second wave feminism, which we'll talk about shortly, is because they thought it would destroy traditional family values and that mothers should really be with their children.
Right. And that was, obviously we know that that's the patriarchy lashing out back at it, being like, no, don't challenge the norm. This is what you should be accepting and you should feel happy about that. And we see that all throughout the first half of this film with Joan and just her day-to-day life. And with her husband, he's so cold to her. He just treats her like she is just a fixture within his household. And if she doesn't and if she has everything she needs, like, I think that's very poignant, the scene in the opening of the movie where she's in the house and the guy's like doing a checkbox. He's like, oh, you have everything you need. House is fully stocked. You got this here, you got this here, you got all your checkbooks. You're really like, what more can you want? You should be happy. If you're unhappy, that's on you. And that's what the therapist keeps reminding Joan. That's on you, not on the system or your husband or your daughter, right? And so that's what the feminine mystique was able to allow her to, would have allowed her to identify with that in herself and also talk with other women. And you see that in her conversations with her friends, like they're all in some way dissatisfied with their lives, but some people just don't want to admit that or want to go the extent that Joan will eventually go.
Absolutely. And that brings us to what was happening during the time that Season of the Witch was a thing. And when it was made is second wave feminism, which was essentially between 1963 and the 1980s. We bring up because the feminine mystique was released in 1963. So this is a really important time for change for women and very much what Joan needed in her life. So our second wave of feminism, what was happening? What is the context of Joan's environment, culturally, what was happening at the time? So second wave feminism wanted to challenge the roles that had been set out for women for centuries. This was the time we wanted to fight against institutions and essentially our society, and aka the patriarchy. That's going to be the last time we say that word today, which was designed to prevent women from expanding their lives and expanding their minds. Like I said, they were boxed into very unstimulating worlds, just being a housewife. And I know that some people absolutely adore the role of being a housewife, but this isn't about you. You're happy. This isn't you. This is somebody that is deeply, deeply unhappy and wanted to question these traditional roles and what was, quote, deemed appropriate for what women would want and desire and to have, you know?
Yeah, like second wave feminism was all about, we were early in our first wave feminism, we're getting our, inspired by the civil rights movements, we're getting our political freedom, we're getting our political rights, but that doesn't mean anything when we don't have that freedom within our own homes, within our own private sphere, which is supposed to be the woman's center of her domain, right?
Absolutely.
So the second wave feminism was all about women wanting financial freedom, fighting against sexual harassment in the workplace, outlaw marital rape, because that was still happening, the fact that their husband can just have their way with them whenever, giving women a voice, raising the awareness of domestic violence. We see this in this film. Joan experiences physical and mental and emotional abuse at the hands of her husband, Jack. And just making a better situation for women so they won't feel like they're trapped in these marriages or these unhappy homes, and have that ability to make life for themselves at the end of the day and not feel like we are chained or we are, as they are, crated into our home. Like, because we see a lot of symbolism. Joan is being treated much like a dog, like leashed in, collared into her kennel, and this is where you're going to be, and this is where you need to satisfy yourself in your life.
Absolutely. Essentially, that during that time, women's highest purpose were domestic and decorative. Mm-hmm. So if you challenge that, like you said, they were seen as like broken and like, why don't you want this as a woman? Don't you have these maternal instincts? Isn't it what you just desire? Don't you want to have kids and like manage your home? And that's literally all you do with your time? No.
Right?
We do not. Mm-hmm. Some people do. But generally speaking, women, we want way more from our lives. And that was a really, really important time to fight for equality, social equality. You're right. From the home. We had in 1963, the Equal Pay Act. We want equal pay for equal work. Jobs that were traditionally, for men to be for women, vice versa. Let's everybody do the job that they want to be doing. Have, married and unmarried women have the right to use birth control, education equality, and very importantly, 1973, Roe versus Wade. Yeah. We wanted reproductive freedoms at this time as well.
Yeah, like taking the things out of the hands of the patriarchy. Once again, we're going to, and putting it back into the spheres of women, which is sex, abortions, relationship, domestic labor, being treated like human beings. And that was what women were looking for. And that's what we were fighting for. And that's what was scaring the men. One of the things that people found scary about second wave feminism was it scared the men. And they're like, oh my goodness, these women are burning their bras and like becoming like these weird, crazy individuals who are literally going to destroy their family and the crux of our whole society. We don't get these women under control. And that was not the case.
Who's going to do all the housework? Who's going to take care of the children? Why can't we think of the children?
Right.
Well, they wanted liberation, not only out of like our home base, but sexual liberation as well. Mm-hmm. So home, work, our personal lives, the invention of the birth control pill in the 60s, that was huge as well. Within 5 years after the birth control pill went on the market, 6 million women were taking it. American women. A lot of this is American.
Yeah.
It's an American movie. So that is amazing. That puts so much of our reproductive health and status and abilities into our own hands, which was fundamental. And then in 1972, we see groundbreaking books such as The Joy of Sex. I think my parents had that in there.
Yeah.
And Open Marriage. Things were changing.
Yeah, the sexual revolution was happening. Sex was everywhere in the 70s. Like it was all about free love and exploring unconventional relationships. And we see this throughout the film in the context of Joan's daughter and this relationship with Greg that Joan is interested in. And it's unfortunate that in the original cut, they cut out this really important conversation between Joan and her friend where they talk about you can't have sex without love. Because Joan's like, well, can't
boy.
you not, have sex without love? And then her friend's like, no, if you have sex, love comes with it. And Joan's like, but maybe not. And Greg challenges that. He's like, yeah, you don't have to have, right? But that's what that was happening with the sexual revolution was women were starting to liberate themselves from their bedroom. They were starting to have sex before marriage. They're having more casual sex, because like Kelly said, the invention of the birth control, and men and women just started to have sex more freely with one another. And women were expressing their desires and wanting it and, taking back power and not being like, we're not the inferior sex. We're complicated, but we want that to be more explored. And we want to have those discussions. It's not that hard as long as you allow us into the discussion of the bedroom and not making it the man's domain. Like there's that important scene where Joan she's aroused and you could tell she wants to have sex with her husband. And she's like, maybe. He's like, we're doing good, kid. Cuddle, kiss, turn over. And you're like, oh, okay. Like she's not even allowed to express her own desire because she's taught that that's inappropriate. To have those thoughts, to even think about having a liaison with someone else outside of her home, she's like, oh my goodness, I can't think about this. This is terrible. I'm a proper woman.
Yeah, absolutely. Joan doesn't really understand this more hedonistic lifestyle of, let's say, her daughter and Greg, who definitely inflames her lady loins when she first sees him and later on. But she doesn't understand it. This free love, casual sex, no commitments, no entanglements, because that's not how Joan was raised. I have a lot of assumptions here, but just seeing how done up she is and how just very stoic and non-emotive she is for really the first half of the movie, it's kind of going against what's considered normal and what's abnormal. It's kind of what's at play here and adds to that inner conflict that Joan has in this movie. Absolutely. And you see, her daughter Nikki is kind of this representation of this 70s time because she's being raised in it. This is what her life is. She gets it. Yes. I want to go back to that dream. So the movie, let's talk about the movie. The movie opens with this very symbolism, heavy dream. And there's a lot of those. There's many dream sequences that tell us a lot about the inner workings of Joan's mind. Yes, she's seen a therapist and he tells her that dreams reveal truths. And yes, you are feeling trapped and isolated. Absolutely. And if I think I remember correctly, he even says but isn't this of your own doing, Joan?
Yep.
And yes. And a portion of it is there's obviously societal pressures, familiar pressures to be in that kind of situation. And so many people were married at that time. That was very, very prominent at that time. The marriage, so quick facts, marriage rate was the highest in 1920 at 92.3%. That makes a lot of sense for the 1920s, right?
Yeah.
But going into since 1970 to now, the marriage rate has declined almost 60%. Less people are getting married, but it was still super common at that time. It was still expected. That is, that's just what you do. You get married, you have kids, you die. And that's just kind of how it was for her. So she consciously went into this, but I think there's also the unconscious pressures that we all feel and have living, just being a human being in this society, right? Conflicting pressures between herself, her family, her husband, society. But what I thought was really interesting of that opening scene. So Joan is walking behind Jack while he reads the newspaper. They start moving through the branches only to have them hit and injure her. Then there's this moment where Jack is eating an egg and Joan sees a baby on the ground. And that, my interpretation is that he is in charge of her fertility. Her reproduction is left on display, right? And then we see Joan swinging in a white dress. What does all of that normally symbolize? Purity, virginity, chasteness, sweetness, passivity.
Yeah. But this loss of innocence, that's her sweetness, her girlhood given away to this man who neglects her and has no care for her well-being at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Then we see later on, and you briefly mentioned this earlier, but there's this nether dream. Again, these dreams are very, very important to the overall narrative of this movie, where a man is showing Joan her own house, not just any house, her own house, going room to room, telling her what this wonderful house has to offer. Here is this person. This is what they offer you. And, you know, a phone book, got to do your taxes. Don't forget to pay those bills. This has everything that you should need, meaning, Joan, you should be happy here. This has everything you could possibly need. As women apparently don't need anything else in life besides a phone, a kitchen, washer and dryer, you know, but then it makes sense where she sees herself in a mirror and she is an old hag.
Yeah. And what I love about that scene too is he mentions quite often as he's doing his checklist, like, you know, you have this and these interesting channels and, you know, Billy, and he can help you with all these things and et cetera, et cetera. And it's like almost accepting that, yes, we understand, we see that you're unhappy, but there's some things that you can do off to the side that your husband doesn't need to know about, or maybe he does know about, but he's accepted it because you're making yourself somewhere happy somewhere else and it's not really his problem. And that also kind of like relates down later into the film about how like we have these white upper class, middle class women, these WAPs choosing these really kitschy things to distract themselves, to make themselves happy, right? But they don't really know who they are. They're just gearing their words to the et ceteras to find fulfillment in their life, even though, you know, they're not happy. We know you're not completely happy with the fact that here's your gilded cage and this is it for you. But we will accept the misdemeanors that you will do later, as long as it doesn't hurt your husband and the reputation that he has to sustain. I like the et cetera distraction thing, because your foundation is not good. Your foundation is unhappy. All these extra things can only bring you fleeting moments of joy. You got to change your foundation. And there was another really great moment in the movie that I found where it was Nikki and Greg. So Joan's daughter and Greg, her not her boyfriend. They're just banging. They're just banging. They just hook up every once in a while. Yep.
Hanging out.
He's an instructor too. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then Joan's friend Shirley, and they're all kind of hanging out, and poor Shirley is super drunk. But Greg says, she's like, she has so much life in her. Like there's so much going on. She's full of life and vigor, but she's too uptight to do anything about it. When we see Shirley, who is desperate and obviously struggling in her status in life and in her marriage, she is a bored wife, right? She states drunkenly that she's past her prime, but she's tearful because she's not done yet. Your life is not over. It doesn't have to end once you become married, but that's what you're taught, that this is just your life now. You do not get anything else now. That's it. Yeah. This is it.
And she gets mad at Joan when Joan questions that and be like, well, do you think so? Like maybe. And she's like, who are you to talk about this? You know nothing. You have no experience. How dare you talk down to me? This is what we do. This is what we have and accept it. And if you can't accept it, well then fine. Like that's on you. But like, she is very closed off. Like she's like, I was given this narrative when I got married and I have to die in this narrative. And Joan's like, well, I'm questioning the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what the whole season of The Witch is about. Why we're here today. Question the narrative. And there's this other poignant moment that I noticed this time around watching the movie. And it's when Joan and Shirley, Joan's driving her home because poor Shirley is super drunk. And Shirley says to her, like, please come over to my house. Just come home with me. Because if you're not there, he won't jump all over me. And that's regarding her husband and her coming home drunk, meaning that he will be mad if she comes home drunk, because you see her husband standing in the doorway, arms crossed, mad that she has a life. She's gone out with her friend. She's got drunk. Sure. Hey, we do that. But she's coming home late and he's mad. Because this is how I'm interpreting it. She's mad because she has a life outside of the home, a little bit, at least a minuscule amount of happiness outside the home.
Well, also too, he's probably angry at her for like, you're not controlling your liquor and stuff like that. So you're an embarrassment in front of our friends and our peers, you know, because, and they're all going to gossip about it. They're all going to talk about, you know, how drunk Shirley got type thing. So it's all about reputation and status as well too, especially among all these guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There is one thing that we would be remiss if we did not note about the feminine mystique and Betty Friedan's ideas. So she was criticized by some feminists for her lack of attention to issues that affected non-white, poor, and lesbian women. And apparently she made some not so great remarks later on in her career as well to these people, which is terrible, terrible. The feminine mystique was really geared towards not an invalid place, but to our white middle to upper class women.
Yeah, and then we also need to address too that because second wave feminism really kicked off because of this book and because of these ideas, second wave feminism is really primarily focused on the white middle class woman and their experience, and it does tend to not look at the side of people of color and the women of color and what they were experiencing as well. So there is some racism within it as well, and it really clumsily addresses racism and how it also alienated women. So we will be remiss not to mention that as well.
Totally, because let's bring up the fact of white privilege. And yes, you're mad because you maybe want to work, but you don't actually have to work because your husband's making enough money to sustain all of you. And aren't you lucky that you get to have that and now you're mad? Again, definitely not saying their unhappiness is unvalid, but it's just a bit more nuanced than that.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. So we want to jump into the witch and the hungry wives.
Let's talk about our hungry wives. Because that's what they were.
Yes.
They were starved for something else.
They want life.
Yes, we all want life. They desired life outside the home.
Yeah.
Yes. So another thing that was happening in the 70s, besides sexual revolution, second wave feminism, was the rise in interest in occultism and witchcraft.
Mm-hmm.
So witchcraft spread like wildfire through the feminist movement in the 60s and 70s. Essentially, they go hand in hand. The witch, and we've talked about the witch many times, is the original rebel against the patriarchy. Third time. But there is a massively strong link between second wave feminism and the symbol of the witch. Witches symbolize opposition to patriarchal forces and, essentially allows that the personal is spiritual. And this is the time of Joan.
Yeah, so in the 1970s, we saw this like Americanized version of Wicca transform itself into a magic-based pagan discipline that is more nature-based and spiritual movement, but with heavy tones of environmentalism and feminism. So just a very brief thing, Wicca or being Wiccan is like another subsection of being a witch. That started more in the 1940s. It does have, it is rooted in feminist beliefs because you're worshiping a female deity or a goddess. And your core tenets are all about advocating the environment and women's rights and body and promoting positive energy. However, it's very traditional in the sense that it does have a bit of a patriarchal structure to the way things are. So witchcraft in itself is more of a branching away from that. And really what Kelly was saying, embracing feminism, embracing the ideas of when you're entering into religion, attracted to a female deity, you're also facing and questioning misogynistic beliefs and the organizations of the structure. And one of the most fundamental books in the 1970s that came out to inspire witchcraft among women in the 1970s was The Spiral Dance, a rebirth of the ancient religion of the great goddess done by Starhawk. It took witchcraft to a new level of spirituality, of feminist spirituality. It was an idea of reclaiming a woman's right to be a witch and to be powerful. This book came out in 1979. And this is where women were able to start explore the goddess traditions and feminist spirituality and connecting to the symbolism of feminism within the ideas of the witch, because the witch represents women's power, the inner power within us, and is not part of a hierarchical structure. It is something on its own and is asking women to trust their own intuition and to no longer suppress themselves. But it became very taboo because you're incorporating this with feminist movements, and we get the rise of political organizations in 1968, which is the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, which was going out in the streets and organizing public protest and street theater actions to really be a counterculture to the patriarchy, right? And to questioning things like, why are we getting married? You don't need to get married. Like questioning these things that we are told is supposed to be normal in our society.
Yeah, there's been like this centuries of a blending between feminine power, feminism, witchcraft, the symbol of the witch. Absolutely. So it absolutely makes sense that we saw an uptick in the interest in that. So why are women drawn to witchcraft? Why was Joan attracted to these witchy women that she would hear about, right? And like you're saying, yes, women are drawn to witchcraft for the power and self-worth. They can express their femininity, lose the oppression from a lot of main religious organizations and belief systems, which are often very patriarchal, they're very oppressive, and they don't look too kindly on women and allow us to have the freedom that we desire in life as a human being. And I really liked the idea of feminist spirituality. I just liked that as a term. I thought that that was really wonderful, and I think fits very wonderful within the movie. Essentially rejecting religion as a tool of the patriarchy. This is their own place, their own religion, at least their own belief system, sense of power. We know witchcraft has been historically very rebellious, but also self-empowering.
Joan is able to ask questions, right? And then within witchcraft, within the ideas of feminist spirituality, she's able to start asking questions and start getting the answers that she's seeking for within herself. Not outside of herself, but within herself, and trusting herself. That's one of the things that women are constantly taught, in the 1970s and obviously now, not to trust ourselves, not to believe our own feminine, our own knowledge and our own ideas, and just to be listen, to do what we're told and to not question.
Yeah.
And Joan is questioning. And that is what, when I look at the rise of witchcraft in the 1970s as coinciding with that of the feminist movement and sexual revolutionists, women are questioning. They're asking questions. They want more answers. They don't want to believe that this is it for me in life. This can't be it. I need to know more. And rising up against the things that continually try to suppress us. And like Kelly said very early on in the beginning of this, political upheaval and the rise of witchcraft go hand in hand. They are, we see this because the witch is all about opposition. She's our internal rebel. She will always constantly question what is being told to her, and she'll always want to know more, and she'll always want to have that ability to exert her own power and her own voice as well.
Absolutely. And we've definitely talked about this, folks, if you haven't listened to us before. I talked about how historically, again, witchcraft is also related to devil worship. Ooh.
Yes.
But devil worship was more seen as a distortion of the worship of the horned god. And the horned god represents the spirit of the hunt, of animal life and vitality, but also the wilderness, nature, sexuality, and the life cycle. And that'll come into play in this movie. The witchcraft allowed women to regain personal strength, autonomy, confidence. And that is a big one that we see in this movie, an increase in confidence and empowerment in their lives. But also in a patriarchal society, women are only valued through their reproductive years. And that is the opposite of witchcraft. They, Wicca generally, they worship a goddess in three forms: the new moon, the full moon, and waning moon. Essentially appreciates and celebrates all life stages of a woman.
The idea of the unruly witch and her sexuality and embracing all her various stages threatens the nuclear family. The nuclear family is set up within a box, within a home. You have a hierarchy when a
literal box.
Literally, you're literally in a box. You're literally in a hierarchy. Like, what does mom say? Well, what does dad say? Because ultimately it's going to be his word at the end of the day, right? But then that doesn't happen. The modern witch is challenging. When I'm saying the modern witch, the witch of the 1970s was challenging that narrative, and continually challenges that narrative by saying, I don't want to live in a box. My world, the world is my home. I am one with nature. And like Kelly, you said, you're bringing up the images of nature, of the horn gods. We see Joan outside in the woods, gathering herbs and stuff like that. Like, she is taking herself outside of the public sphere, outside of the private sphere, and made herself public and made herself known to the world.
Absolutely. So coming back to our movie here at the beginning, we see Joan and her friends are all talking about this resident witch, this witch friend that they know, but they're also kind of laughing at the absurdity of some of these more new agey-ish beliefs. They kind of think it's nonsense. Joan, less so. She's very intrigued. So her and Shirley go to see our resident witch for a tarot reading. which piques and spikes Joan's interest, but also fear in this world. But again, this was a time that people were getting more interested in these otherworldly powers and like, what was this? Is this magic? What is this witchcraft? What does this actually mean? What does this do? What can this do for me? Which I thought was really interesting because the beginning, everybody's kind of just guffawing. They're like, oh, you know, whatever. Oh, the witch.
Yeah.
You know, so I thought that that was really interesting because we get to, you know, the movie.
Well, because and they're making fun, like, oh, they're dancing out and howling naked in moonlight and stuff like that. And yeah, exactly. Ooh, the devil's gonna get our daughters, right? Because that's, and again, the Catholic Church saying, oh, the devil, if you bring the devil into your home, you're destroying your family and you're leading your women into temptation and stuff like that. But they make fun of it because they're just like, oh, it's just another fad. It's just another kitschy thing for us to get involved with, or that's just really weird. But Joan is like you said, she's interested because there's something within her that she's like, wait a second, I'm having these dreams and they're kind of like premonitions in her mind. We said that we see that later on, like especially at one point when Marion the witch says something as, oh, when you have dreams, and she's like, oh, what do you mean, like premonitions? And she's like, oh, okay, like, you know, like she within herself has these ideas and these questions and these feelings, but she doesn't know how to express them, and she can't talk to her friends about them because they just laugh, and it's just like, you know, I laugh it off and be like, ha ha ha, that's just, you know, funny, funky stuff. Like no one really believes that, right? And Joan's like, well, maybe I do. Maybe I think about these things as well. Yeah.
So she holds that in until the end of the movie, which we'll get to at the end, but absolutely. And I want to go back to the dream. So she later on in the movie starts having these dreams of this intruder with a mask, which kind of looks like maybe it could be the horned god of witchcraft descent, right? She's afraid of this intruder. He forces himself into her safe, comfortable space, her safe, convenient, comfortable space, her home, and onto her. So like I said, the horned god represents the spirit of the hunt, animal life, vitality, nature, wilderness, sexuality, and the life cycle. And she keeps having, she has multiple dreams of this intruder into her life. And perhaps he is representing the fear of change in her life and the fear of sex, which I think she feels absolutely, because change is huge. Change can be anxiety driven. It can be so scary. And also sex can be, especially, let's talk about, again, our context of the 70s, that sex and going outside that box and trying to be more sexually liberated and sexually free is terrifying, especially if it's not how you've been raised. That's not what you know. And God, I'm sure Joan and her husband almost never have sex.
Oh, probably, right? Well, the fact that he can't even kiss her on the forehead when he says goodbye to her, like he barely even looks at her. Didn't even touch her. Doesn't even touch, like kisses air and leaves, but like he doesn't even notice her. He doesn't even notice how she's changing. Like it is significant. Like when you're watching this film, you see, and like you brought it up earlier about like how constrained Joan was earlier as like the unhappy housewife, hair tightly put back. She's very dressed, very formally, right? And she's very uptight. Like she doesn't like when Greg swears or something like that. Even though he's like, are you sure you don't like it? And she's like, no, I don't like it. He's like, well, just tell me then. But then you see in the movie that she gets more, her hair is always down. She wears more flowing outfits, and her husband doesn't even notice.
Doesn't even notice how she's
those
looking. Outfits.
Right? Like, how can you not notice how your wife is not dressing differently? Because he doesn't see her as an individual. She is just a fixture in her home. And I think so when you, and the dreams also correlate with that and her change as well. Like I really like how you bring up that idea, like that in the very beginning of these dreams, this horn god coming in, because it's like this idea of change and transformation within her. And as in the dream, she acts very perilous to it. Like she doesn't know how to defend against it or to fight for herself. She doesn't have that empowerment with, but like, as you see, as she's growing in her own empowerment, as like embracing the identity of the witch, the dreams change as well. And the dreams, the intruder is no longer this, I feel like this idea of change, it becomes her husband, because she's like, I don't want him coming back. I don't want to go back to this life. So she arms herself, right? But she learns how to protect herself as these dreams go on too. And it's like, as she's learning more about herself in the witchcraft and this idea of empowerment and speaking up for herself and like embracing this life that doesn't have to be scripted. It doesn't have to be an escalator. It could be something else.
Absolutely. So she's like, time for a change. And then she goes witchy shopping, and then a song comes in, and that's amazing. And She gets her candles and her herbs and her cauldron and everything that a witch, I'm assuming, would have.
Yes, we would have those on our altars. I'm like, I have yet to get myself a knife thing, but one day I will.
She becomes a solo practicing witch. And then when we talk about the end of the movie, she's initiated into a coven. But I want to kind of talk about, yes, the sexuality aspect of it is massive. Sexual revolution, sexual liberation, sexuality as a witch, everything kind of starts changing. She meets Greg. Libido, kind of very repressed libido, starts bubbling up to the surface. She hears her daughter having sex with Greg, which in her mind are like, that's kind of weird, but that's not really the point. The point is that it hits her libido hard. She's so repressed and she cries. And that is so much an important part of this. And then her husband, Jack, gets mad because she didn't stop her child from having sex and hits her and calls her a sick woman.
Yeah. Yeah. He goes after her in the sense of just like, how can you let this happen? This is inappropriate. As a the wife and mother, you should have gone in there. And he said, you should have kicked some ass. He says this quite often to Joan.
Yes.
We're going to kick, you should kick some ass. Every time he's like, when that child gets home, we're going to kick her ass. You're like, wow. Like, you think so beating your daughter and your wife is going to, force them to be in this box that they're completely unhappy in, right? His daughter ends up running away from home, I'm assuming other reasons, like she's obviously scared of her father and probably a little bit mortified that her mother overheard her having sex. But at the same time too, though, I love that scene where, Joan, she is encapsulating that sexual energy because she is so repressed and she wants it so bad. And watching the film again today, I love when she does, like, she uses her spells. She conjures Greg to her. And I remember a couple times when I watched it, I'm like, oh, is it really the magic that she's conjuring her to her? And does Greg really come? Or is it really just a failed spell and she just realized she has to call? But I'm like, no. In doing her ritual, in encompassing herself as a witch, she got the confidence. She got this is what I want. I want Greg to come here and bang me. I'm going to call Greg, be like, hey, you remember the old woman that you said it wasn't come here and fuck me type thing, like pardon PG for Salem Horror Fest, but
I was trying not to swear. Good job.
But she has that confidence within herself. And that's what I love about witchcraft is the confidence in this, the power within to trust your own instincts and your own desires and what you want and just go for it.
Yeah. It's so funny that you said that because that's exactly what I thought. Exactly my notes. She does this spell to try to conjure Greg over to her. But for me, the way that I see it as a different person, I see that witchcraft is the illusion of having control over your life. But what it does is actually gives you the confidence. It gave her the confidence to make that call and have an affair with a younger man.
Yes.
And that's what I think is the most important aspect of that, is that it gave her confidence. She never would have done that before that. Absolutely not what she had in any idea to have an affair. Well, not even in her own house, because they have sex in their house, not in her bed, but in her house, so life is reviving. It's starting to happen. It's, like I said, libido's bubbling to the surface. Things are starting to change. She's starting to smile and laugh. You don't see much of that in that first half of the movie, but we do now once she starts expressing herself, having something for herself as well, which is the witchcraft.
Yeah, that is literally for her and she keeps it away. So, which brings us to something on what we want to talk about, because obviously in Season of the Witch and the rise of witchcraft in the 1970s, as it was very white. And it's still kind of, in a way, very white. But we're going to talk about this in the 1970s. So witchcraft tends to, the turn to witchcraft, it tends to sometimes be a trend. And this gets brought up a couple times in the movie where the women are like, this is just a fad. You're just getting into this. And Joan is actually really curious because she says, I'm afraid if I get into this, right? And Greg challenges her on this, being like, this is nothing. You just wanted to get bald, lady, and this is what all this is. It's just following, it's just sex, right? You're saying the devil made me do it. But she's like, no, I'm actually really curious. And Marion also challenges her as well and says, if you're getting into this, this is serious. This isn't just like you deciding that, oh, I'm going to wear something witchy today and feel very witchy vibes. This is a lifestyle. These are traditions. These are passed on from family to family to family. And one of the things that we tend to forget is that a lot of witchcraft in itself has a lot of origins in folklore and traditions of other cultures.
Absolutely.
And finding out the appropriateness of which we should be able to use a certain spell in a ritual that is not appropriating from another culture, such as, voodoo or Haitian, or even in, Jewish lore, like all these different elements of where, magic kind of resides.
Absolutely. There's a complex history of witchcraft and disenfranchised spiritualities that is borrowed from.
Yeah.
White people love to borrow things and say it's their own culture. It's a hodgepodge of other cultures, and then we call it our own. First, folks are colonized, and then they're demonized, and then we appropriate it and we whitewash it. And we see that, and I know, well, that's like, it's important in the 70s for sure, but we see it now in modern kind of internet TikTok witchcraft, right? Witchcraft has a colonialist history. We demonized other spiritual practices for a long time of indigenous people, survivors of the slave trade, and it's just being mindful of where your practice comes from. People end up being so, and you would see it in the 70s, we'd see it now, but they get so focused on the aesthetics of witchcraft, the astrology, the beautiful, look at all the tarot decks I have, and the crystals, and then this, and then that, but they actually lose sight of core values and the core belief system, because that's what it is. It is a belief system that is connecting to yourself, to your community, and to the earth.
Yeah. And so one of the important things, like obviously there is this allure to not just old witchcraft, but also modern witchcraft, is because anyone can reclaim their power through like a hodgepodge of spiritual mysticism. But they're like you were saying earlier, like they're borrowing from various oppressed groups. And it's important to differentiate between an aesthetic and an actual practice. Witchcraft in itself is more than just pretty Instagram pictures of all your crystals and all of your wonderful things. And I know that I, for myself as a witch, have had to go back and be like, ooh, smudging is not appropriate. I should not have white sage because this is part of a Native American tradition. And this is a spiritual practice that, I need to separate myself from. And like, there are elements for women. Like, we're not saying that white women can't practice being witches. We do have a history. We do have elements of witchcraft that do exist within in more of an older folklore tradition. If you go back to Gaelic and you go back to more of the Wiccan, the English practices, but there are elements within modern witchcraft that don't necessarily belong. The ideas of chakras, that comes from Hinduism. That is part of a religious practice. And so it's remembering to respect where these original ideas came from and making sure that they get the proper honor they come from, and the proper credit too. There's a huge thing about, a lot of appropriation from voodoo and stuff like that among white witches, and not remembering that, hey, we need to remember that this is connected to the history and ancestors of a lot of people of color. And it's important because they used those elements of that witchcraft as a form of activism and dismantling systems of oppression. So It's always important to follow, support, and honor all witches, especially witches of color and of different cultural and spiritual practices.
Exactly. Respect where your craft comes from, and understand that there is a weight behind calling yourself a witch. I don't think that term should just be thrown around, because guess what? Privilege, folks. Being called a witch in different countries can lead you to ostracization, abandonment, and death.
Yes.
Like, that is not, so just be mindful of what you're calling yourself, because you like the aesthetics of crystals and maybe you like tarot readings. Maybe you're not actually a witch, and just remember that there is context and there is more important aspects to being a witch than just saying, I am a witch.
And we all say, like, one of the most important things among the witchcraft community is we always want to say, like, the way you practice is the way you practice. There is no standard to how you practice as a witch. However, so just saying, like, just being respectful and mindful of your practice and remembering where it's coming from, and just remembering that when you are practicing as a witch, and we see this in Season of the Witch, that Joan is constantly asked, if you are doing this is a very serious thing. You're not just doing this for shits and giggles. You're not just doing this, to have all the lovely trappings around the house and have that spirituality and confidence. There is a weightness that comes with calling yourself a witch, because at the end of the day, being a witch is part of a political and social upheaval and activism. And even when I, as we'll get into later, discovered my own journey into witchcraft, I realized that calling myself a witch comes with its own trials and tribulations as well.
So should we move on to Season of the Witch?
Yes, let's do this.
All right. So now it's 2021. Where are we at? Who are we? Why are we talking about all of this? Why should you care? Why should you listen to us? And where are we at as women in 2021 viewing Season of the Witch as a movie? Where are we at with regards to marriage, kids, divorce? Here we are, context 2021. I myself personally have never been married. I've never wanted to. There was never any interest in it. I didn't see any value in getting married ever. Even as a kid, I was not one of those little girls that dreamed about weddings and dreamed about et cetera, et cetera. It didn't mean anything to me, and it still doesn't. And I'm going to say that I do recognize this definitely comes from a place of a privileged standpoint, because in many areas of the world, our fellow LGBTQ folks are not allowed to marry the people that they love.
And for me in 2021, I resonate very strongly to this movie. As you can tell, I love this movie because I was once an unhappy wife. I was once married.
You were a hungry wife.
I was I went from being, Nathaniel's wife to a hungry wife to a Season of the Witch. Literally, This movie is kind of what I experienced, because these ideas are not gone. These still exist. I remember thinking that I needed to get married. I needed to have a house. I needed to have a child. Even as a bisexual woman at the time, I was just like, well, this is what we do. This is how I need to follow what we call the relationship escalator to be a successful woman, white woman in this generation, in this society. So what Joan was feeling in the 1970s still exists today. It's still part of our day-to-day life. And so I understand what it's like to be married. I understand what it's like to be divorced. I understand what it's like to reinvent yourself. So let's get into this.
Well, we do have some American statistics, but about 90% of people in Western cultures marry by the time they're 50 years old. Mm-hmm. In the United States, about 50% of married couples divorce, the 6th highest divorce rate in the world. But we have to say, both marriage and divorce rates have decreased between 2009 to 2019. And according to the US Census Bureau survey, the top 3 reasons for divorces were incompatibility, infidelity, and money issues.
The rise of a divorce has an interesting history. So, and we're talking US right now. In 1969, Ronald Reagan, he signed the nation's first no-fault divorce bill. This is really interesting because at the time, people could not seek out a divorce unless it was for mental instability, or you had to really prove that you were in a life and death situation to get yourself out of this divorce. This now allowed women, particularly, to no longer need to prove a wrongdoing to get a divorce. They can seek a divorce for any reason at all.
Absolutely.
This started to change laws all across the US and doing a legal transformation of marriage and the divorce. And there was a divorce revolution from the 1960s to 80s, especially in the 70s, people were had this ability to get out of marriages now. It obviously was not culturally accepted. There's a whole other thing on top of divorce. There is this cultural stigma, you got divorced, you're a failure in your life. You're a failure in your marriage. You need to make this work for the children. Yeah. However, at the time, though, getting a divorce was still more easy. It was easier accessible for the wealthy elites. It was a lot harder to get divorced if you were in a very poor or working class vulnerability or a person of color, because you were not able to access. It wasn't accessible to you. It was also very expensive as well.
Yeah. And since I've never been married, I've also never been divorced. So I have no frame of reference here besides watching my friends go through divorces and seeing what that is all about. Getting married and marriage is a massive deal. It massively changes your life, and so does divorce. Yeah. But it was so wonderful that people were allowed to be to get divorced because they were unhappy. Or this just didn't work out. Okay, well, let's just get divorced instead of having to prove by any doubt whatsoever. Nope, we have to divorce. This is it. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. We chose to get married. We should be able to choose to get divorced. women were actually, they felt freer and more confident in the 60s and 70s to get divorced, leave those bad marriages. Our hungry wives were like, okay, I'm hungry for more. I'm able to get it now. Able to get it. Feminism, sexual revolution, the employment changes for women allowed them more freedom to get out of a marriage. Marriage used to be about duty, obligation, and sacrifice. But marriage started becoming more of a thing to focus on individual fulfillment and personal growth, right?
Yes.
And happiness within the marriage. It wasn't about this obligation to the family. It was an obligation, yes, to your family, but also more importantly, to yourself. And if you are unhappy, get out of that situation. So yes, the 70s marked a period for changes in the institution of marriage and what it looked like. It evolved. Marriage evolved, divorce evolved. Interesting fact, 1962, about half of American women agreed with the idea that when there are children in the family, parents should stay together, even if they're unhappy. By 1977, though, only 20% of American women held this view.
Right. And I think that's so interesting that you bring up, because you bring up the items of the sexual revolution impacting the way the marriages are changing, right? The swinging 70s, the spouses are finding new partners, creating higher expectation in marital relationships. You said the feminist movement. And like you said, the psychological revolution, this idea that you do not need to marry just to have a family and to have a decent job. You can marry for love. The idea of a soulmate, the idea of a soulmate marriage. I mean, I have this quote from social historian Barbara Defoe Whitehead, who talks about divorce was not only an individual right, but also a psychological resource. The dissolution of marriage offered the chance to make oneself over from the inside out, to refurbish and express the inner self, and to acquire certain valuable psychological assets and competencies such as initiative, assertiveness, and stronger and better self-image. We see this in Joan. She hasn't applied for a divorce. We get an accidental murder, but
or was it accidental?
Ooh, but we don't. But this is what divorce was allowing for people to have now. We get lower marriage rates, and we get less, and then over time we'll get less divorces because, like you said, birth control, higher incomes for women, but being able to get a divorce and changing the idea of marriage and what marriage is all about was allowing people to have more freedom and to move forward with their lives.
And there's another fun fact. So it's like, we talked about, what about the children? Yes. But what about the adults, right? What about the adults? So from an emotional and social perspective, about 20% of divorced adults find their lives enhanced, and another 50% seem to suffer no long-term ill effects, right? According to research by certain psychologists like Mavis Hetherington. So adults who initiate a divorce are especially likely to report they are flourishing afterwards and they're doing just fine. Are you doing just fine, Jess?
Oh,
aren't you thriving after you've been divorced?
Yes. And I love that you bring that up because, well, okay. So when I got divorced, I thought I wasn't going to thrive. I thought I was going to be like my biological mother and going to have to go on welfare and was going to be, in this terrible situation and see what she went through. Because what I saw what my mother went through when she got a divorce, and it was terrible. And I remember how in the 90s, they tried to save marriage and don't get divorced because look at how it impacts the children. It is terrible. Okay. First of all, it is the way that people handle their divorces that impacts the children. It is not the actual act of getting divorced. If they had stayed together, my life would have been so much more worse. And the fact it's just the way that people handle getting divorced is that changes how people handle it. But I remember being so fearful about getting a divorce because I was like, I'll end up like that. I will end up in a situation where I'm worse off than I was before. But when I finally made that step, I'm like, oh no, I'm much better off because I'm much happier, because when I'm happy, I can do the things I want to do to make my life better instead of being in a marriage that I'm miserable at and just not making things better for myself at the end of the day. Yes,
absolutely. Marital happiness is important. And another fun fact. So later in the 2000s, marital happiness is hovering around 60% in men and women. 60%. Okay. So things are changing. And so in my mind, I was like, what if Jack wasn't killed by Joan?
Okay.
I think that with her newfound confidence from becoming a witch, that she would have eventually divorced him. She would have been like, you know what? Maybe it would have taken some time, but she has this confidence. We know in the 70s, we're able to get divorced. If she's like, I'm just unhappy, this is not working for me anymore. There you go. we can get divorced and move on with your life, and she can do whatever it is that she would like to do. She was deeply unhappy. She was unsatisfied, unfulfilled with her position in that marriage and her status in life. She was bored, hungry. She wanted more than what was on her plate, right? And like I said, you really start to see her smile when she starts making these conscious decisions for her that are outside of the box, where she starts having sex with Greg. She feels more liberated.
She starts to think about what Joan wants, not what Jack wants or what Nikki wants, what Joan wants.
Yes. And we are taught for so long, and even still in ways, that what we want in our relationship with ourselves is not as important as our relationship with our family, with our partners, or whomever, particularly partners and family, right? We forget about ourselves. Yeah. Getting married is a massive decision. It's a massive life-changing decision with legal implications, complications. I think it's deeply outdated. I don't think it's needed for a committed relationship to happen. A legal document does not make anyone happier and make them less likely to harm you or leave you, right? And that's how I view marriage. So now, since I'm just on the marriage topic, so Jess, you were married, got divorced, and now vow never to get married again. Yes.
Why? Because I don't want to be entangled in that way again. That was stressful. You entangle your finances with them. You entangle your life together with them, like everything. And when we ended up having to separate, it was traumatic because we had to figure out finances. We had to figure out stuff. I had to and I felt like I lost like a sense of myself. I also felt like a giant failure because like around me, everyone else was having houses and kids and they're doing really great in their life. And I'm like, I'm like in my mid 30s getting divorced and I have 6 cats moving into an apartment with a bunch of old people. Look at me. Right. And I felt like a failure as a woman, but at the end, so, and the reasons why I vowed never to do that again, because I never want to put myself in that position again. I also value my independence way too much now to want to give that up. So even in the fact that I do live with one of my partners, we also still have very independent lives of each other.
Right. And having kids is an enormous decision, even bigger than the marriage, because you can divorce the person and never see them again. That's frowned upon if you have kids. So, and that's fair, right? Yeah. So having children is a massive, massive decision. I also have never wanted kids. I never envisioned myself with kids. And at 38, I remain very firm in that desire, never to have them. Again, no interest. I honestly see them as more of a hindrance to me and in my life than an additional benefit. Children, no. They're hugely expensive. Going down like facts and figures, holy moly, are they expensive. They take a hit to your sense of self and identity. Your romantic relationship with your partner takes a massive hit. Definitely. It's no easy feat. So when people say, well, why don't you just have kids? It shouldn't be so casual. It should not be so casual and nonchalant. It changes your entire life. It takes so much out of you financially, emotionally, and physically. It can change your body. It just is absolutely life-changing. So that's a big decision for one to make, right?
It's huge, especially for women, because like when we decide to want to have children, it could stall our careers because we're still not in a place in society where they'd be like, oh, okay, it's okay for you to not continue promoting yourself in your workplace because you have a child to carry. Like, it's okay if you want to take time off to care your kid. I'm like, well, I don't really want to because I want to be here for this project. But like, you're given these like free cards to go do these things. But at the same time too, you're like, no, this is going to stall my career because I have to go home for a year to take care of my child. And then I also have to be right. And I'm not saying that's not a bad thing. Like there are women out there who are very successful and have children and have great careers.
Totally.
But for some of us, we have that fear because that's still very prevalent for us.
Yeah, there still is, unfortunately, uneven parenting.
Yes.
Even though our fathers do have a bigger role than, let's say, in the 70s when Joan was a wife and a mother, she was a full-time mother.
Yes.
And he was allowed to work. Now, yes, we can work, we could not work, we have more choice and freedom, but most of the home labor and the parenting labor is still falling upon women. Anytime I go and visit my family and see that dynamic between my brother and his wife, both have great, successful careers, but at the end of the day, more of the responsibility still falls on my sister-in-law. still does. And that is just like, I guess it's still this ingrained thing that the woman is going to take charge for the children.
And you bring up this really great thing about how we live in a different world now than our parents did and that Joan and Jack did, right? Income equality it's real. Higher education is hard to obtain. There is debt. There is lack of employment and career. There's, you know, the improvement in wage and loss of long-term job security. Like, you know, like we don't have those same things that Jack would have had. Then, like, if the job that he was in, he would have been in it for forever. Like, that's his job type thing, right? He has that stability. We often, as millennials, have to work second or third jobs. There's a lot of depression and mental health issues that are more present more than ever. And we're like, the world is literally falling apart around us. And so I'm less likely to want to bring children into a world of this nature, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Last thing I'll say about children and having them is that there still is, it is less than the 1970s, thank goodness, thank Satan that it's different, but there is still this entrenched belief, deeply rooted belief that the maternal instinct for women is innate and unconditional. That is not true. And we should not expect that of women. And if you don't want to have children, you are not a bad woman.
Mm-hmm. You're not. No.
No.
And that leads us into reinvention. And we're going to see this in Season of the Witch with Joan. She reinvents herself when she decides to embrace the mantle of the witch, to embrace the idea of what it is to be a witch. And it's really interesting that when we see this rise of witchcraft, we see it always tends to rise during times of social upheaval. And we're seeing it now. We are seeing witchcraft is on the rise again. It's very progressive, it's very inclusive, it's very diverse, because the witch is the new feminist icon. She was a feminist icon back in the 1970s. She was for Joan, because Joan was able to reinvent herself and find a way. And this is what's happening now again with the modern witches. We are becoming unruly figures, and we're threatening the patriarchy with our feminist ideas, because we want to see because we're seeing a rise of regressive politics, and we're seeing a resurgence of white supremacy and xenophobia and anti-feminist sentiments. We have a global pandemic. We have a climate crisis. Women and people are being marginalized again. So when the witches are on the rise, because she's like, no, can't have this. There is so many great things that are happening in the world, and so many ways that you can live your life. And Joan shows us that there's a new way that she can live her life. And that's where that image of the season of the witch comes from.
Absolutely. And you said I and we numerous times because you are a witch.
I am a witch. Yes, I am a witch. And I know you don't call yourself a witch yourself, but you relate a lot to a lot of witch sentiments and a lot of witchy ideas.
Absolutely. So yes, I myself am not a witch. I'm an atheist, and probably later on a non-theistic Satanist, whatever. That's future Kelly to figure out. But not spiritual whatsoever, but I do strongly resonate with the symbol or archetype of the witch, because I have pretty much always been independent, rebellious, and outside many social norms. So, I mean, I understand, the symbol of the witch and all of these things, and why feminism and witchcraft is related. So much of our work that we do of Spinsters of Horror is related to the symbol of the witch. It comes up time and time again because she is a feminist icon, right? Lilith,
yes,
our feminist icon. So we have seen now, because it's 2021, witchcraft has gone mainstream. And there are many different definitions of what a witch is. Jess could talk about that forever. Not everyone's a pagan, not everyone's Wiccan. And Pam Grossman, who is an author and does the Witch Wave podcast, she said, as quote, "I'm doing magic when I marched in the streets for causes I believe in." You're right. The witch has always been, there's always been an uptick. There's always this parallel between social upheaval or something going on politically or big changes in the world. Oh, the witch is back. The symbol of the witch. Witches are here. We can't have our world and our environment and our nature being harmed by, like you said, racism or patriarchy, any kind of oppression whatsoever. They fight that. She has always fought that. And right now, casting spells, assembling altars is kind of lucrative. You're seeing people embracing that, but also being able to build small businesses off of it. You do see a lot of stuff on Instagram and TikTok and stuff like that. But, there are people that are doing right by it and doing good for themselves and doing good in the world with it. but it, it ebbs and flows, right? There's different definitions of it. And sometimes, unfortunately, we do fall into our false witches, or the aesthetic witches, as I want to call them, who don't actually practice the craft. We talked about it. You say you're a witch, that comes with centuries of history. So you better know kind of what that actually means in a cultural context, historical context, in your own personal context, right? There's a commodification of witchcraft. We talked about cultural appropriation, but the commodification is a little icky for me. What do you think about that, Jess?
It is very icky. I remember a couple years ago when it was Sephora was coming out with their witch kit, where they had white sage and tarot cards. And I was mad. I'm like, because I was like, as a witch, what's important to me is the history that comes with it. What comes with the activism that comes with it. And like I said earlier, when you take on the mantle of a witch, you're not just taking on an aesthetic. Yes, there's an aesthetic that comes with it. We all love Stevie Nicks and her flowing stuff. And obviously,
magic.
I'm obviously displaying it myself as well, because I also feel like I feel more free in myself when I dress this way, but at the same time too, and I also feel more comfortable when I have my elements around me. But I also recognize too that there is a power that comes with calling myself a witch. I have an active responsibility to speak out when I see things that are inappropriate, that are happening, that is, against other people, against people of color, when it's against, when we're seeing misogyny happening in the workplace, when I'm seeing, I see that there is a responsibility that comes with calling myself a witch, which is being part of an activist, and is calling things out, and representing that archetype of the witch, the unconventional woman, making change and making strides in the world. So when I saw this marketing and this commodification, I was mad, because I was like, I understand what you're trying to do, but at the same time too, though, it's not necessarily respecting what comes with the whole idea of being a witch. Yes, there's an aesthetic that comes with it, but there's also a responsibility. And I almost want to say Peter Parker, with every great power comes great responsibility.
It's true. It's true. And that's what I've learned. If you're going to say you're a witch, then if somebody asks you why you're a witch, or what does that mean to you, I think you better have something to say and have an explanation for what it is that you're doing. Witchcraft, 70s, historically, now is an unconventional source of power.
Yeah.
And when there is upheaval and trauma and terrible things happening in our world, where we feel that we're out of control, there can be this element of feeling like we can control. Or throughout history, the attempts to control women, which have masqueraded as crackdowns on witchcraft, we see the witches rising up, are symbol of female power, especially in the face of violence, male violence, misogyny, and all of that. It is a form of activism, and it always has been. I feel like that is something, witchcraft is feminism. It's inherently political. There was a quote by someone who did Witch and an author in, her name is Gabriella Herstick, in Sabbath magazine. She had said that witchcraft is feminism. It's inherently political. It's always been about the outsider, about the woman who doesn't want what the church or the patriarchy wants. So when we have terrible things happening in our world, they're going to bind together. They're going to come together. Online covens, solo practitioners, right? The internet actually, for all the bad things it is, but it does bring people together, this magical resistance, right? This the hashtag bind Trump, right?
Yeah. Digital
hashtag
covens,
witch the vote.
Yeah. Digital covens binding with each other around the world to do global magic, to help each other and to create a community, because sometimes you can feel very isolated as a witch in areas when you don't have that community as well. I'm a solitary practitioner, but I love when I see other witches doing stuff in the community. I'm just like, yes, you go, girl. I love it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then we come to the end of Season of the Witch, when Joan is initiated into the coven. So like we said, initially she's practicing on her own as she's kind of figuring it all out. Yeah. And now she is ready to come and worship in quotations, practice with other witches. However, strong symbolism throughout this entire movie. I'll go back. The opening of the movie has Joan with a red collar and a red leash being led by Jack like a dog to a cage. At the end of the movie, we see Joan with a red rope wrapped around her neck like a collar and a leash, led to the altar on her knees to worship another god or gods. She used to worship her husband, and now it's perhaps a religion. And so it can be interpreted in different ways. This is why we said, and we opened this, is she just trading one gilded cage for another? Kind of up for interpretation. I think she is.
I do in a sense. Like I think that she has traded a different type of cage in the sense that she will never truly be recognized as herself as an individual. Like she'll always be seen as part of a fad, as part of a, and I think that's more at the end of the scene where she's at the party there. Like I do, like when I do see the binding of the rope around her neck and bringing it to her, and like, are you going to worship this way? That to me, I get like, because I'm like, I don't like that type of structured worship or that type of structured like religion. This is why I draw to witchcraft, because I'm like, I like that it's less structured and that I can practice as I will and follow my means. But when like you get into Wicca, you have to follow more of a structure, and I don't like that in a sense. So I can kind of see where like Joan's like, well, am I trading one set of beliefs for another? Or am I not truly being true to myself and my own belief and my own practice?
Yeah. Is she truly an individual? Maybe not yet.
Yes.
Right? She's found something new, something very exciting that has given her confidence in new life, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
But the movie's almost over. The last scene is at a big party. She's after, she's kind of done she's hidden away for a bit with her grief. Over Jack's death, but then she's at the party and there's this allure to her, this confidence, right? She's holding herself differently. Her head is higher, her shoulders are back, and it's
outrageous hairstyle.
Oh my God, her elaborate, I almost want to say elaborate costuming and her hair and everything is just different, right? Makeup for sure. And one of the women that is at the party is just like, she doesn't say this, we can tell by the body language. She's like, there's something different about Joan. What is going on here? Yeah. She's like, hi, Joan, how are you doing? Like, you look great. What's going on? And she's like, I'm a witch. But then back here in the background of the party, they're like, oh, you remember Jack's wife?
Yes.
So she either will always in some way be referred to as Jack's wife. But now she's the witch. She's not Joan yet. She is a witch, or she was Jack's wife.
And even then, like they treat her as like a party figure,
novelty,
right? A novelty. Like, have you met our special guest Joan? She's very aloof. She's a witch now. She's no longer has a husband. She's now on her own. Like she is a novelty because she's new. She is something that women weren't before. She is on her own. She is finding her own identity as a woman. She has now become an unconventional woman, and she's a novelty to these other women at the party, right? And this absolutely happens to us, as Kelly and I will talk about very shortly, as unconventional women, that sometimes when we find ourselves in circles with people, they're just like, ooh, what are you? Like,
and they're like, what are you exactly?
Who
are you and what are you doing?
Right? Like, where's your husband? You're not married? Like, you don't have children? You're 38 and you don't have kids yet? What's going on?
What is going on?
Yeah.
So folks, we are here to tell you and tell Joan, wherever she is in the world, that there are so many ways to live your life. The default social expectation in our world now still is heterosexual monogamy. But there are so many diverse ways to live and conduct your life, your sexual life, your romantic life. It's inspiring, really, the varied ways that you can live your life. Where I have personally landed now at 38 and being single, or a term that I recently learned and I really enjoy, is self-partnered. Okay. So I am single. I love it. Okay. And here are some reasons why being single and untethered is amazing. So there's different terms like responses of horror. We've talked about this before. I have like fully enveloped and taken in the term of spinster, live alone, no partners, have a bunch of cats, that's like kind of a cliche, but it's reclaiming that term and reclaiming being single, but positive about it. So wonderful aspects to being untethered is that you can focus on yourself and other important relationships like your family and friends, because often in our default life of monogamy and heterosexuality, friends get pushed to the side, and your friendships are so deeply important to you in having a life outside of romance. But the relationship that I find that gets put aside in the 70s, even now, is the relationship with yourself. It's really important to have a positive, healthy, loving relationship with yourself. Okay. And that is something that we are told not to do because it is seen as selfish. Do not take care of yourself. Do not put your needs in front of anybody else's, but you should, because you will be happier for it. Trust me. Trust me. It can be very empowering to live alone and single and as a free agent. It's important, and for me, not to be defined by my relationship status or anybody's relationship status. Independent, freedom, flexibility. You can travel, you live alone, be responsible for yourself only. There's so much more to life than romance. There's so much time and energy for single women to put into finding partners that it takes away time from yourself. And that can lead to people settling. Do not settle. Do not settle because you're afraid to be alone. Don't settle because you're afraid to be single or to be lonely. And quick fact, some studies have shown, and I could link this somewhere for sure, but show that women who remain single and child-free actually live longer, happier, healthier lives. Okay. And being alone does not mean you're lonely. Loneliness is an emotional response to feeling unloved and unseen. And that can happen in and out of relationships. We see that in Joan in Season of the Witch. She is not seen. She is essentially invisible to everyone around her. And that is not a good feeling. That's not what you want to be feeling. You want to be loved. You want to be seen. You want to be heard. And you can do that in and out of relationships. Absolutely. You do not need romance or a partner or kids or marriage or any of those things that people tell you need to completely. You are a complete whole person as yourself. And that is so important to me. And as 38 years of life, I've come to really realize the importance of all of that and how true that is. I want to make a note on couples privilege because that is a thing. And I'm not saying it negatively because it just is inherent in our society, that society values couples over non-couples. Okay. So this is primarily what we can see in monogamous situations, but it also is seen in polyamory, which is where Jess will definitely jump in. But couples privilege is the culturally entrenched priority and measure of value given to couples by society, either by the public perception of them and how you're seen in the world visually, and the legal status of them. Talk about the legality of marriage, because that means couples are more valued. They are seen as a real commitment, the real relationships. In marriage, that means that is a real relationship. So any other relationship that I've had, whether it was 8 years or not, was not real. And some sad things about couples privilege, which is predominantly, you see it in marriage, is if I fall ill and I'm in the hospital, only my family could see me.
Yeah.
Or my spouse, but I don't have a spouse. My family lives in North Bay. But because, let's say, a romantic partner of mine, we are not entangled via legal means, they are not considered family. That part of it really upsets me, because if I was sick, I would want my friends or my partner, if we're not, we're not married, to be able to come see me and give me support. You get spousal insurance benefits. There's tax benefits to being married. I don't know if you can chime in on some of that stuff, because I was never married, but I know that stuff exists.
There were tons of benefits to being married. Like insurance, right? My ex-husband, I could be on his insurance. When him and I divorced, I got half of his RSPs, because when we got divorced, I was legally obligated to whatever he had and whatever I had, right? There were definitely a lot of benefits to that. And this is why it's a really interesting jumping off point that you bring up couple privilege, because when you jump into the poly world, which is what I am a polyamorous woman. being poly in a modern world is actually overtly a political movement. It's not just about free love and being able to have relationships with many people and have, like, it's like everyone looks at polyamory as always just being like, just having sex with everyone all the time. No, that's open relationships, and then you can have that. Polyamory is more about relationship and creating more emotional attachment to other people in your life. But it is overtly a political movement because it's rejecting these capitalist ideas and these conventional lifestyles of that when you're a couple, you automatically get these privileges. Because yes, as a couple, all my other partners don't automatically get privileges because they're with me, right? They don't necessarily are can get this. Like if we were married, then yes, they would have they'd be included in my benefits. We can go and get a mortgage together, right? Like as a poly couple, I can't open mortgages with any of my partners because I'm not legally seen as a couple, because I'm seen as a liability because that relationship could end. So dating multiple partners as a poly person is inherently political because I'm not linked to any kind of economic or political avenues or resources, right? I'm outside the mold. I'm breaking the mold, and so so I keep saying polyamorous, but also it's under the umbrella of ethical non-monogamy, which is common in many same-sex and also heterosexual relationships. And we're seeing more and more people moving to these alternative styles of relationships because of
jumping outside the box, Jess.
Because we're jumping
outside the goddamn boxes.
Out of the box. We're addressing toxic monogamy. We're addressing ideas that one person cannot be your sole everything. That cannot be to fulfill all your needs at all day. And in all my relationships, all my different partners satisfy different needs within me. And not one pressure is put on one person to be my everything. Because that's a lot of pressure. I felt that pressure. It is so much pressure to be someone's everything, to be that person that has to take care of them, but also make decisions with them and to make sure, like I never felt like I had my own life. I was a unit. It was me and this one person, and this was it. It was me and Nathaniel. We were a unit. I never had my own identity, but as a poly individual, I have my own identity. And that was something that was very important for me when I moved into my polyamorous relationships, is my identity, having my identity. I became a witch just before I got divorced. My husband hated it. And when I moved into all my relationships, this is who I am. This is my identity. These are my boundaries. Do not cross them. If these, I was able to assert myself and have healthy romantic relationships with people. I was also able to have more, I'm able to have more financial freedom. I'm able to, have my own finances. And I know that some poly couples, they come together and they entangle those resources, but that's all within negotiation. And I find that's really interesting in non-monogamous relationships. You're breaking the societal standard of communication. You're having healthier relationships because you're talking about your needs, you're talking about your wants, you're being assertive about your independence. You're not just compromising on all your decisions. Like there's constant conversation, which tends to not happen in a lot of monogamous relationships. And I'm saying this because I was in a monogamous relationship. I know what happens. I'm not just, someone saying like speaking about this outside the box. I know what goes into these things. And I'm not saying that polyamory is perfect for everyone. One of the things I learned in my journey is that there's a relationship spectrum. You can be in a relationship with whoever you want and however way you want. And you just need to know what you want as an individual. And like you said, Kelly, at the end of the day, being self-partnered, being also in polyamorous relationships is you need to know what you want and have your own identity and walk into them very confidently and be able to express those things and to be able to hold those things forward, because polyamory is not perfect within itself. There's some issues in it, the one penis policy, mansplaining, unicorn hunting, people trying to use it to fix their already not great relationships, like those cracked foundations, lack of racial diversity is, and it is also primarily, middle class and white, but we're also trying to open more to more communities and saying like, no, this is something that everyone can be involved in and express, but it's not perfect. And there's things that we still need to work on.
So that is just 2 ways to live your life. And there is so much. And I also, because this is a video, want to shout out to books. We're big proponents on reading and researching and getting books. Jess, I think, has 100 polyamorous books by now. There's Spinster, which is making a life of one's own, living apart together, because I never want to live with a partner and you can do things. The Smart Girl's Guide to Polyamory, The Ethical Slut, and one of my favorites, stepping off the relationship escalator.
What changed my life?
It is. And I think that it's important for folks to get out in the world and see what else the world has to offer you.
Yeah. So why does this relate to Season of the Witch? Because Joan is starting that journey and embracing the identity of the witch and embracing the ideas of second wave feminism, with the feminist mystique, and addressing those political upheaval moments and stuff like that. She is saying that you can live an unconventional life, and here's how you can do it. And she's just starting that journey. The women of the 1970s who did that opened a way, and they paved a way for us women to continue these journeys and continue educating people and keep talking to people about other ways in which you can live your life.
And on that note, let's move into Spinster's final thoughts. But before we round off this episode with our Spinster's final thoughts, we wanted to extend a big old thank you to our sponsor, Brutalities. As spinsters, we obviously adore tea. So we really love sitting down to watch a horror movie and drink a hot mug of tea. Please use the code SPINSTER15 to get 15% off your order. For our beloved Canadian listeners, please reach out to the company for shipping prices.
When I first saw George Romero's Season of the Witch, it was a few months before my own marriage would dissolve. And I remember I resonated so much with the character of Joan. She was a lonely, unhappy housewife of the 20th century, and so was I. Not much had changed. Like, despite all the work that feminists had been doing, the rise of witchcraft, I felt like things were still the same. Women were still finding themselves in this narrative of riding the relationship escalator, marriage, house, kids, and then death with the same person. And that is it. And if you resisted this in any way, people turned against you because you were not fulfilling the societal norm. This message is still very present today. And if you're an unhappy wife in your marriage, and you're told that there's something wrong with you, and it's not the marriage, it's not the other person, you need to fix it. If you don't fix it, you're a failure. That's why I stayed in a 10-year marriage, because I was struggling to make it work because I felt like a failure. I have always resonated with the archetype and the image of the witch since I was a child. I saw freedom and empowerment. I saw activism. I saw ways in which I can make things change by engaging with the idea of the witch. I dabbled throughout my life, always in secret and in shame, because I grew up in a Catholic household and it was often demonized. And later on in my marriage, I would eventually start to embrace my fully witchy instincts, and my husband demonized me. He would tell me I was casting spells on him in the middle of the night. He would tell his friends that I was bringing darkness into his home and that I was making it hard for him to meditate. And I was like, bullshit. When I found the witch, I found my voice. I found my ability to speak for myself, and he just did not like that. I found my own journey. I found my own friends. I found my own life. So like Joan, I was able to embrace my life and find myself. And I pursued my wants, I pursued my desires, and I did not hold back. I did not want children, and I knew this, and this is why our relationship failed on many other reasons. You know what? And I'm glad for it. I'm standing up for myself, and I am breaking away from a societal norm. I found my identity, and I found who I am as a bisexual, polyamorous witch. I am an unconventional woman of the 2000s, and I have 2010s, and I have found happiness. And while identifying as a witch has come with my own trial and tribulations, it's a new activism in me that I want to show other women and other ways of living and not being dictated by the patriarchy, because the patriarchy, what they want from us, keeps us compliant, silent, and under control. And I don't want to be silent anymore.
Thank you very much. I will say again to folks at Salem Horror Fest, this has been an absolute treat for us. Another thank you. And it is the Season of the Witch. I was very, very happy to revisit George Romero's severely underrated Season of the Witch for this special occasion, as I think it's a very relevant movie for 1972, 73, and even in 2021. It brings up the discussion of the value of women, our place in the world, and what we want and desire out of life. Whether it is to have one monogamous partner or four in a polyamorous lifestyle, kids or no kids, dogs or cats, backpacking across Europe, or just exploring the city you're in. As the millennials, who are way cooler than I am, would say, live your most authentic life. I can happily say that I am thriving in the life choices I have made for myself, but I think I can honestly say that because I've tried a variety of different things in life. Living alone and having roommates. I've lived with a romantic partner. I've done serial monogamy and polyamory. I've done casual dating and casual sex. The common thread is that whenever an intense emotional or even a casual relationship ends for me, I've always had a sense of relief. I am always very, very beyond happy to be single again and untethered. It doesn't take away the impact that these relationships, whether big or small, had on me in my life, but it's something I've noticed as a pattern. I was never a wife, nor will I ever be a witch. I am Kelly. Life is a journey. It ebbs and flows and goes forth and whichever. Your wants and desires can change too, and that's okay. Absolutely. I like to think that Joan is still on her journey now. I think the end of Season of the Witch is truly the beginning of the next chapter in her life. She may or may not continue on being a witch, but what's important is that she made the choice to become one and can choose not to be one. Choice is the important factor in all of this, folks, and it's such a powerful, liberating one. So, listeners, what will you choose? The wife or the witch, or a delicious combination of both?
I love that. Thank you. And that ends our episode on George Romero's Season of the Witch. We want to thank Dance with the Dead for our intro and outro music, Robies, and for Brandon, who does all of our promotional work and our materials. And also to all you listeners, we love you guys so much. And thank you so much for having us here at Salem Horror Fest and just, helping us get to where we are today. Remind you to follow us on our website, www.spinstersofhorror.com, and all of our social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Spinsters of Horror. And we also join our coven. You can find us on Facebook at the Spinsters of Horror Coven.
We now have a letterbox because we're old spinsters and it takes us a while to get into hip things, but search for Spinsters of Horror and you can check out all of the movies we've covered on the podcast and our ratings. We're also on YouTube, search Spinsters of Horror, and we have special fun videos on there for you to watch. Like this one will be there eventually. As well, please rate and review us on iTunes and any podcasting app you listen to us on, because that obviously gets our hard horror work out there to the world. We have merch, and so please visit TeePublic to purchase our t-shirts. And also, if you like what we do and you've liked what you heard today, and if you're a new listener, thank you for coming out and giving us your time. We do have a donate button on our website. But folks, until then, remember,
the future of fear is female.
By the light in my hand, by the breath within me, by the earth which I touch, by the names of the spirits, by the resplendent angel, together with the princesses of Mercury and Earth, I conjure thee.